coming a day late, but we still have sermon scraps this week. This Sunday was a somewhat difficult topic to work through as we think about anxiety and the different ways that anxiety can show itself, and how some are the natural results of living in a sinful, broken, fallen world, and that we see that in how our bodies are physically affected by sin. But also we see that there are spiritual components to our anxiety. If we are actively living in disobedience to God, if we are being distrustful of God's sovereign rule and reign, that can also lead to anxiety. But we also see that in either kind of extreme, whether it's physical, spiritual, or somewhere in between, the call for the believer is to reflect, to search, is where is my heart in this? Where is my anxiety coming from? And then in all things, we seek first God's kingdom and righteousness. I wanted to today look at maybe a connected passage, even though it's not specifically talking about anxiety, but I think it speaks to a lot of our experiences with anxiety. And so I'm going to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It says this: "I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul, in this passage, doesn't name anxiety, but when he talks about his contentment, he says, I'm content with weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions, with calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And I think anxiety can fit into that. But I also think for some of us, anxiety feels like a thorn in the flesh, this thing that is always present, and we don't know what God is doing with it. And I think it's telling that Paul doesn't specifically describe what this thorn in the flesh is. There's some conjecture, there's some looking at the surrounding context and saying, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that, but we don't really know what this thorn is. And I think that's important, because the point that Paul is making is that in the midst of whatever this thorn is, weaknesses, hardships, insults, persecutions, or calamities, whatever it might be, the message that God's grace is sufficient speaks to all of it. So what is the purpose of this thorn in the flesh? Well, for Paul, what he writes about is that, verse 7, it is to keep him from being conceited. For Paul, this thorn in the flesh is to keep him humble, to say that his whatever he has that he can boast in is not something that he can boast in himself, but it's because of what God has done in him. And it can be hard to see, but what this thorn in the flesh teaches us is that our hardships, our suffering, our difficulties, our weaknesses, and for some that includes anxiety, there's purpose in it. There's purpose in the suffering. God is doing something to sanctify us in the midst of suffering. There is a couple of authors that I've come to respect, Henry Cloud and Stuart Townsend. They talk about suffering, and they talk about this idea that suffering can come from various places. That it can, again, come from the natural result of living in a broken and fallen world. It can come from our own mistakes, and we can bring it upon ourselves. It can come from the sin of others. Other people being and acting sinfully can cause us to suffer. In the midst of all of that, it's important to see that God can be and is active, that there is purpose in our suffering. We might not always see it in the midst of it, but God is active. It might be to keep us humble. It may be to refine us, to prune us, to make us more holy, but God is active in our suffering. And that's what we saw in Hebrews 4, that not only is God active in our suffering, but God meets us in our suffering, that there is grace and mercy in our time of need. And in our time of need, we can approach him with boldness, with confidence, knowing that he is present with us. And that leads to this second part of what we see about the thorn in the flesh. Verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this. We see the apostle pleading with God. And we read that and it's like, okay, that reads pretty, okay, 3 times I asked God to take this away from me. But this word pleading is kind of a ringing out, a going before God with all that we have. And even saying 3 times I went to God like this indicates a strong request to the point of exhaustion, going before God time and time again, saying, God, will you take this from me? And I love God's response. But he said to me, God says to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My presence, my mercy, my love is sufficient in the midst of your suffering. And this is why when we are called to seek first the kingdom of God, that call is for all of us. Our weaknesses are not an excuse not to seek the kingdom of God. In fact, our weaknesses become a reason to boast in God's strength as he empowers us and enables us to seek him first, as he sanctifies us so that we desire to seek him first. But in the midst of all of this, in the midst of our anxiety that feels debilitating and crippling, in the midst of our weaknesses that we feel like are good excuses not to follow because we're struggling that day, God says in the midst of those things, my grace is sufficient for you. So we don't know what this thorn is. We all may have some iteration of it ourselves. But we know that there's purpose in it, that in the midst of weaknesses, God is at work, that there's purpose in the hurting and the suffering in our weakness. And that even as we plead with God, it doesn't mean that God doesn't hear us when he doesn't remove it. God is saying, I'm enough for you. And this is a lesson we need to learn. And even when we have learned it, that thorn doesn't always go away. But we still see that God is sufficient. And so our response then to this thorn in the flesh, which may be anxiety for some and something else for others, we can do as 1 Peter encourages, to cast all our cares upon God because God cares for us. Casting our cares on him doesn't mean those things go away or the burdens just disappear, but it does mean that we recognize God is present in those things. And our response is not to turn to self in the midst of weakness and suffering and hardship, but we turn to God because God's strength is enough for us. His power is shown and displayed all the more clearly in our weakness. And so we go to God, we cast our cares upon him, and we recognize that in the midst of anxiety, in the midst of hardship, his grace, his presence is sufficient for us.